Okay, hello and welcome everyone. I'm Zach and I'm here with Book Passage. Tonight we've got a very special event and I'm going to introduce our authors to you. We've got speaking today Stephen Johnson, who is the best-selling author of 13 books, including Where Good Ideas Come From, Farsighted, and The Ghost Map. He's also the host and co-creator of the Emmy-winning PBS BBC series How We Got to Now, and the host of the podcast American Innovations. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and Marin County in California, with his wife and sons. His previous book, Enemy of All Mankind, has just come out in paperback and is now available. And his new book, which we're here to talk about today, Extra Life, is also airing as a series on PBS on Tuesdays and is available to stream on pbs.org. And interviewing him today is Kevin Kelly, who is the senior maverick at Wired magazine. He co-founded Wired in 1993 and served as its executive editor for its first 7 years. His most recent book is The Inevitable, which is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller. His other books include the best-selling New Rules for the New Economy, the classic book Out of Control, and his summary theory of technology in What Technology Wants. Thank you so much, Kevin and Stephen, and you guys can take it away. And here. Okay, perfect. Welcome, guys. Thank you so much.
Hello. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Kevin.
Let me just start off with some compliments for your fabulous new book. It's a very easy read. It's full of news, and it's very, very timely. Briefly, the book is about this marvelous gift that we've been given of extra longer lives and how that came about. I know you're a prolific writer, all those books, and you're a fast writer, but my gosh, writing a book where the central themes are often about plagues and pandemics, how did you manage to write a book with such timing?
Entirely by accident is the answer. Well, first off, let me just say thank you for that, and such an honor to be here with you, who's been such an influence on my career, and such a two things. Also, in addition to that, the Long Now Foundation. This is the ultimate, to me, kind of Long Now influenced book. Right, we're trying to look at long-term patterns and in the length of human life. And also to Book Passage, one of my favorite bookstores around the corner from us in Marin. So this is delightful. So this project turns out to be it's old. I've been working on it, on and off for more than 4 years, and it had kind of come out of this. The book I wrote 15 or 16 years ago called The Ghost Map, which was a book about cholera in London in the 1850s, and the solving of the problem of where cholera was coming from, which was in the water and not in the air. And that book was very much written as a reminder of what life had been like just at the time I wrote it 155 years before, and how dangerous life was, particularly in big cities, that you could drink a glass of water and be dead in 48 hours. And that was just the reality of life in the most advanced cities in the world. And that book, kind of instilled in me this idea that there is much more to be said about the importance of public health initiatives and progress that we make, and kind of slow and incremental progress, and the importance of it, and celebrating those kinds of achievements. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, I thought it'd be interesting to do a book like that, except it was looking at a kind of a broader set of trends. And it occurred to me that it'd be interesting to do a history book, effectively, where the protagonist, as it were, was not, or the central focus was not, a great leader or a military conflict, but a number, just this kind of basic measure of human progress. How many years do you get to live? And what are the odds of your children dying before they reach adulthood? That kind of fundamental unit of measure. And I thought that would be interesting. And so much of my work is about trying to understand the causes that drive changes in society. And that's, as we'll argue, we'll talk about it today, I think maybe the most momentous change long term. And so I thought that would be a really interesting topic to dive into. And I thought, sitting there in 2016 2017 that if it took me, 3 years to put this thing together, and I thought at the time that it might also be a good PBS series. So I was hopeful that we'd be able to do that as well. And I thought it'll come out around 2020 and the timing will be good because that'll be the 100-year anniversary of the end of the Spanish flu, which is really the last point at which life expectancy declined in a kind of systemic way for a year or two because of the great influenza. And so I thought there'll be this kind of nice historical symmetry to a book about the triumph of public health coming out in 2020.
Perfect.
So I literally, I had no idea what 2020 was ultimately going to mean. And in fact, most of the book was written by early 2020. But the show had not been made at all. In fact, the show wasn't even really officially greenlit really until the summer of 2020. And so by the time we actually really started making the program, we had this interesting, I kind of integrated COVID into the book. It's there in the book, but it's not kind of front and center. But if people get a chance to see the PBS show, it really bounces back and forth between the history and the present moment. Like I'm in there talking to Fauci about the Moderna vaccine in the vaccines episode. And it, to me, that was a really interesting intellectual exercise, which was to make, I started to think about it as like, it's like the 200-year history of right now, of this like very moment. And so there's a timeliness to it that was entirely, fortuitous, although it's tragically fortuitous.
Right. Yeah. Yes, I think the PBS series is much more contemporary and of the moment, as you said. It's kind of a sense of the big now, right now, where this is a sense that the things that you're talking about are not so foreign and historical. They're actually very present and relevant. And so that's beautiful. The book takes a little bit more of a longer view. And one of the things I appreciated about your book was this, a perspective that I think we both share, which is that science is not done by heroes per se, that there's much more of networks of ideas that are moving forward, inevitably in many cases. And the public health and this longevity is certainly one of them. And it's in one sense, to see if you agree with this, I would say that if we try to tick off all the advantages that technology gives us, the kind of unambiguous advantages, the primary one, the one that nobody would argue about, is longevity, right? I mean, it's sort of like, it's the most unmistakable, the least controversial. The first one that comes to mind is the fact that we have longer lives. In any kind of a chart of progress, that'll be number one. And your book is exploring, well, why is that? Or where did that come from? Who made that? What are the steps that we got there? And the answer is that it's complicated. There are tons of people and lots of counterintuitive advances that contributed to that. And you kind of go through this network of contributing parts. It's not a single thing, it's many things. And the book is a story about all those many things that give us this great gift.
Yeah, that's right. And we should probably just set the stage a little bit for folks who haven't had a chance to read it yet, and this isn't actually so much of the show, so this is more about the book. Just the facts of it, because there are a couple of things that people, I think, who might know a little bit about the history of longevity, but might not know some of the full sweep of it. And a bunch of this I didn't know until I started digging into it. So one of the most fascinating things, I think, is that we believe now that life expectancy had basically what I call in the book the long ceiling of about 35 years for all of human history until about 250 years ago. And that was because childhood mortality was very high. So 40% of children would die before reaching adulthood. Infants would die, but also 5-year-olds would die and 10-year-olds would die. And that pulled the average down a lot. And also, it was harder to live to 70 or 80 or 90. If you made it out of childhood, it was still very surprising if you lived to 80. And so you had a lot of early death and you had shorter lives, shorter adult lives. And this was the case. We believe this. I mean, there's a whole section at the beginning of the book about going back and looking at hunter-gatherer societies, trying to figure out what their life expectancy was. And we believe it was about 30 to 35, with, again, 40% childhood mortality was just a constant from 10,000, 12,000 years ago to 250 years ago. And so first off, to me, the only period where it actually declined probably is post the invention of agriculture, when things got worse. So there, over that whole period, there's really not a period of like sustained improvement. We never really got above that long ceiling over that whole period, as far as we know. There may have been some exceptions somewhere that we don't know, but by the time we started measuring it all around the world, no one had made any progress. And that's interesting. When you and I have spent a lot of time thinking about long patterns in human progress and technological development, and we cataloging all the things that were invented between agriculture to 1750, and of all that ingenuity, all that creativity, all that technical advance, we didn't move the needle at all in terms of extending life and keeping kids alive.
And there's a little bit, one of the things I learned from your book, that's a little bit of an expansion of that, is that ceiling, the 35-year ceiling, doesn't mean that there weren't old people or older people at the time. That was an average, and that there might have been a fair number of people who were a little bit older. And what that would mean, that if you took a snapshot, if you came into a village, the village might look modern in its sort of profile, because they would have some children and have teenagers, and they would have middle-aged people and have some old people. But what that snapshot didn't show you was the hundreds, if not thousands, of children who had died that you didn't see.
Yep.
And it was those early deaths that really skew the average down to 35. Yes.
And for those who are interested in the kind of statistics of it all, the demographers distinguish between life expectancy at different ages precisely to deal with this. So when they're trying to measure the overall health of a society or a community inside a society, or comparing different societies, you talk about life expectancy at birth, which factors in all those early deaths. Right. And in a society with high childhood mortality, the average will be will drop dramatically. But you can also talk about life expectancy at 20. If you make it to 20, how old will you expect to live? And so just so people can get a sense of the difference here, in 1850 in England, where we have probably some of the best numbers, life expectancy, was in the high 30s. But if you made it to 20, your life expectancy would be 60. So it's much higher than that. Right. But today, if you are 20 years old in the United Kingdom, your life expectancy is 85. Right. So we've made improvements on both ends of the spectrum.
Right, exactly. Right. One of the statistics I thought you were going to get to, but didn't in the book, was how did, say, the hunter-gatherer ceiling of 35 compared to other primates?
I don't know the answer to that question, actually. That's a gret question. So now,
so is it like, is it sort of above or about? Is it about gorillas? Do chimpanzees? What's their natural ceiling or age or average age? I have no idea. I didn't look it up, but I was kind of thinking you might have gone there.
That's a great question. Yeah, this would be the first book Zoom that I've done where I actually go and Google something about.
My guess is that it's probably very close, maybe a few years more, but I would guess, maybe there's 30-year-old gorillas. I
think there are 30-year-old, but I don't think there are a lot of. I don't know if there's 70-year-old gorillas, but that's that's a good question.
So there is this huge what's the word I want? New thing in the world. And this new thing is the gift of the scientific method. And there's, basically that's what it comes down to. That is the explanation. The explanation of our longevity is science and technology, and technology that came about because of science. And one of the chapters that you kind of deal with that was of great interest to me was the fact that a lot of this rise in our longevity is very, very recent.
Yeah.
It's and the method for generating it is also recent. I mean, recent is like almost within my lifetime recent.
Yeah.
And so that was an appreciation that I don't think most people have, is of the way in which we're benefiting from something that has only been invented almost since I was born. And I'm thinking, of course, of the double-blind, random statistical, random sampled trials, also called double-blind trials. That was something that is only invented in the 50s, and we take it for granted as kind of like almost the essence of science. And yet, it's like really, really current, and that is really propelled things like the COVID vaccine that we have now.
Yeah. So I have 17 things to say to what you just said.
Lord, you wrote a book about it.
So the first is, I want to just put a pin in the that it was science, Enlightenment science and technology. There's a slight, that is generally true, but there's a slight complication to that, but let's come back to that. But you raised this question of the RCT, the randomized controlled trials,
Yeah.
right? This is basically what we did with, as you were saying, with the COVID vaccines. We had to go through these trials, and you have people who are the control in the experiment, and the people running the experiment don't know who's getting the placebo and who's getting the actual
That's the
drug or vaccine.
double-blind part. So
That's the double-blind part.
patients don't know, the experimenters don't know. Both people
Yeah.
are blind.
So that is a huge advance in our ability to determine whether a given medical intervention works. I mean, it is a superpower, right, that we did not have before.
Right.
And there are two important things to say about it, I think. The first is, and this shows up in a couple of other places in the book, we tend to focus our attention when we write the histories of these things on material objects. When we think about progress, we think it's like, then they invented the vaccine, or then they invented the penicillin pill, and then they invented the X-ray machine, or whatever it is. And those things are important, and the book, covers some of them. But ways of organizing information, ways of looking for patterns in information, new ways of thinking, new tools for thought, to quote our friend Howard Rangel, they are often as important as the material, physical objects like the penicillin pill or the smallpox vaccine. And the RCT is maybe the kind of the gold standard for that. I mean, it's an innovation that makes other innovations possible. It's a kind of a meta leap forward, and it deserves a huge amount of focus. But the other thing to say about it, and this is, something that you and I have talked about a lot. One of our shared interests, and you've, I think, written the kind of definitive work on this, particularly in What Technology Wants, is that there's an interesting kind of sequence to the development of new ideas, technological advances, where we often see these simultaneous discoveries, where it seems like it suddenly becomes possible to imagine this kind of breakthrough for the first time, and suddenly, 18 people are trying to make a light bulb in 1870, when nobody was trying to make a light bulb in 1800, because it just wasn't thinkable at that point. And so there seems to be some kind of interesting ladder that we move along in the progress of technological development. And if you're interested in understanding how that ladder works, everyone who's listening, you should read Kevin's book, What Technology Wants, because it is an incredible account of that. But one thing that I'm really fascinated by, and this showed up in a book that I wrote a couple of years ago, Wonderland, which I did a long now talk about as well, which is every now and then there are these ideas that were actually imaginable earlier, but they didn't show up for some reason. Like the typewriter is weirdly late, as a late arrival. I think the bicycle kind of arrives on the scene a little bit late. There are these laggards that they're ideas that are like behind their time in a weird way.
Yeah, the Greeks could have made them, but they didn't. And they're like, why didn't they?
Yeah.
Right.
And the RCT is like that. It's not, there's some science about randomization that hadn't been fully realized that maybe was deterring it. But the basic structure of an RCT isn't that hard to it seems obvious when you kind of hear it described to you. And so there's a kind of alternate history where the RCTs are invented in 1850. And we suddenly have this ability to separate out the snake oil from the real medicine, and maybe life expectancy improves faster. And the last thing I'll say about that, which is very much related, which is the other thing that really surprised me in researching the book, which is in terms of late arrivals. Medicine itself, in the sense of I'm sick with something and I need to go and, drink this potion or take this pill, I need to go to the doctor and get this medication to make me better. That is also surprisingly kind of a late arrival. If you go back and look at, the pharmaceutical catalogs from 1910 even, every other item in it is like, would you like some arsenic with that? It's unacceptable.
Or we need to bleed you.
Yeah. I mean, literally, like, bleeding was advised by, leading medical figures in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. So it doesn't there's some advances like insulin and things like that, but the real breakthrough doesn't arrive until penicillin, which is the 40s. And since then, we've been on an amazing run, and we have a lot of medical drugs that do extend our lives. But it's a funny thing. You would have thought that life expectancy would have been propelled. We've been actually living longer in the West for about 100 years before that, but it really didn't have anything to do with medicine.
I could almost imagine 100 or 200 years from now, when people would talk about the kind of default assumption of people living in our time, that you got well by taking a pill, which they would think would be ridiculous in 200 years. Because right now, it's like, that's the only way you get better, is you take a pill. And so we've moved, we've come a long way, but this may not be the final destination. But I think one of the points that you were pinning about my remark about science being the foundation, I know what you're going to say, I think. Let me see if I can.
You always do. God damn it.
I would say that we don't want to forget the fact that in addition to scientists and technologists, all these changes required activists and writers and troublemakers and campaigners and politicians to actually bring the social network along that's necessary to have these things. So something could be invented or discovered, and it may take 50 years for it to actually reach everybody.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's right. And that's exactly right. So two things just to build on that, two kind of examples. In addition to agitators and activists and legal reformers and things like that, it's also institutions that actually have to be invented. So for instance, you think about all those arsenic-laced drugs, one of the reasons why you could sell them in 1910 is that there were no government regulators keeping you from selling arsenic in your drugs. And the only thing, the equivalent of the FDA would do until around 1938 was basically they just enforced that the ingredients that you listed were in fact the ingredients in the drug. So if you put arsenic in it, you had to mention that there was arsenic in it. And they didn't actually demand efficacy, like that it actually works, until the 60s. And that's in part because they didn't have RCTs. They couldn't test whether it worked, right? And medical drugs are a very weird product also, because there's the placebo effect, which is a real thing. It exists. So people take something that they think is going to make themselves better, and 20% of the time they actually will get better just for the placebo effect. And also, our bodies have our own pharmacies in the form of our immune system. We're constantly fighting ailments and recovering. And so this is the difference between drugs, medical drugs, and every other product on the market, which is if you buy a fake television set and take it home, 20% of the time you will not see imaginary programs on the television set. It will just be a fake television set. It won't work. But medical drugs actually, because of placebo effect and because our bodies just get better, people are like, oh, I took that pill and it worked. And so that's why regulation is so important. So we needed to invent a new kind of governing body to oversee the production and sale of these things. And that is a really important innovation as well. But when we think about innovation, we tend to not think, oh, and then there are the government regulators who are so important as well. We needed to invent that, but that's part of the story as well. And then, just one other example in terms of the activists. The best case study in that is pasteurization. So in the 19th century, it's one of these things that we forget, milk was very dangerous to drink, particularly in big cities because of spoilage and all these things that we can get into. And so it was a huge contributor to childhood deaths. In New York in 1850, 60% of all the deaths were kids. And in 1865, Louis Pasteur, in formulating the germ theory of disease, comes up with this technique called pasteurization that basically makes milk safe and other beverages. And that's a perfect example of what you're saying. That's a scientific breakthrough. He did it through the scientific method. And, without that, we would have not had pasteurized milk. We would not, milk would not be the safe form of nutrition that it is today. But it took literally 50 years for pasteurized milk to become the standard in grocery stores in the United States, because it took the science wasn't sufficient on its own. It took this whole fascinating social movement for pasteurized milk that literally had, protest movements and angry op-eds and crazy proselytizers making the case for this, persuading people to change their consumption habits, persuading the milk industry to change its production habits. And, that's, if you don't tell that part of the story, we forget really what is driving the change in society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would broadly define, activism, the means of dissemination, newspapers, radio, nowadays, social media, as technological things as well, because they're invented. But I want to shift a little bit to outside of your book and think about the future more, because your book is mostly about the history of where we are and how we got here. It's much more dangerous to think about where we're going. But let me just kind of start with my little story, which is that going back to the kind of inventions that are laggards. And the most famous one is China having basically invented most of the things of antiquity, from gunpowder to the compass to suspension bridges, paper money, oftentimes hundreds of years before the West, independently of it. But they didn't invent the primary golden invention, which was the scientific method. That was the one. So it was always a question, which was named the Needham question, was why didn't China invent the scientific method? Because they invented everything else. And they missed out in the kind of the Enlightenment and beyond, because they hadn't invented the scientific method. So I began to think about that, and I think I claim to be the first person to actually try to write a little biography of the scientific method. I mean, if we accept that this was the most important invention of all time, where's the book about it? Where's the biography? Didn't write it, but I wrote a timeline of it, and I was surprised, like you were, about how recent some of those inventions were in the canonical idea of the scientific method. So I deduce that the scientific method will probably change more in the next 50 years than it has in the past 50 years. So the question is, what does that look like? What would, if you're kind of writing about how we know things in, say, the domain of public health broadly, this prime gift that we have, the prime invention that's changing our lives, what do you see in the next 50 years? Where could you imagine some of the meta changes in how we do things that might produce more good stuff for us? What can you make a guess, looking at the history that you have with the long view, as you do, your zoom view? Do you have any intuitions or hunches or speculations about how this might change in the next 50 to 100 years?
That's a really, it's a big question. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, because I've read a couple of things that you've written where you speculated on these kind of new ways of thinking and new ways of collaborating with machine intelligence that have been
Right, that would be one way, but maybe as you're suggesting, maybe there's an emphasis on the social medias or the way that we make things happen in society.
Yeah.
A lot of people are very down on social media, and I suspect you have a different view on that. Can you imagine how someone might make social change happen in the next 50 years?
Oh yeah, well let me before we get to the social change side of it, but just in terms of kind of advancing the scientific method, I mean, to me, the one place I think we know that the change is going to come from, that is going to be genuinely new, is combinatorial exploration. So if you look at there, actually, the PBS episode that we just aired, which is about basically antibiotics, but it's about kind of the development of drugs in general, and it traces this. There's a kind of a sub theme in it, which is about how we discover new drugs in general, not just the drugs we discover, but like how we do. And the kind of the line goes from, the classic Alexander Fleming story with penicillin, where it's like, oh, look, there's a mold growing on my desktop. And that kind of serendipitous discovery. And then you kind of get to engineered discovery, which is engineered serendipity, which is like, okay, we know that mold may be able to be antimicrobial in their function. So let's go all around the world just looking for interesting molds and then put them under the microscope and check and see which ones work and then scale those up. And then you get into the 70s and 80s and you start to get this thing called rational drug design, which is like, no, we understand the actual chemistry here. And so let's build molecules targeting these particular conditions, understanding the kind of basic structure of it. And that's kind of rational. And that's a huge breakthrough, which I knew almost nothing about before I started diving into this project. Now, what we're going to get to, just starting to get to right now, is kind of a machine learning accelerated version of that, where it's like there are a billion potential compounds out there. We don't have in human time the ability to go search through all these different kind of configurations, but DeepMind can do it in an afternoon. And so the ability to kind of run through, say, hey, we're trying to target this particular receptor. Of all the drugs in the world that have been made or could be made, give us 20 that might be interesting. And that process of exploring the possibility space of a near infinite number of potential compounds that might work on this particular target, and giving us a short list, that's a huge advance, right? That is going to be a major breakthrough. It may help us, as we talked about it briefly in the show, with a major problem we have now, which is we haven't made any new antibiotics in a long time, and the bacteria are evolving in resistance to it, and we have these superbugs. And so machine learning as an accelerant of that process, of that discovery process, is almost certainly going to be a major leap forward. The other thing that, I can't remember who I was talking to, I think it was someone like David Ho, who did the one of the main figures in the AIDS cocktail. One of the things that we lived through with COVID is, the extraordinary part of this whole story is that they had effectively designed the mRNA vaccines in early February.
In days after the sequence.
Days after, but literally before there was an outbreak in the United States, like we had the architecture for the vaccine. They didn't, in the show, Fauci, when I interviewed Fauci, he's like, if you told me 30 years ago that you could design a vaccine without even having the virus, my mind would have been, and it's because they had their genetic sequence for the virus and they didn't need the virus. They could figure out how to build this thing. It was all software, right? So that's a crazy leap forward that we're living through for the first time, and we should all pause to just be amazed at that. It's an incredible advance, and we're going to the dividends for that. But last thing, just to wrap this up, what slowed us down were the trials. right? We still went through 3 phases of trials to make sure that the thing worked and that it was safe and all that kind of stuff. And so the question is, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, do we get to the point where we can actually run those trials in silico?
Right.
And just be like, okay, we've completely simulated, not just the human body, but like a representative, diverse population of, 10,000 people. And here's how the drug works, and here's how the virus works. Take this virtually and get back to us in 5 minutes with the equivalent of 9 months of RCTs.
Right.
That would really be helpful in a future pandemic.
Right. And there may be ways not to necessarily skip over it, but maybe to accelerate it. And where you decide, based on these genomes, we're going to do a small test of N 100 instead of N thousands. And there's also, since we're talking about the future, a lot of drugs, not necessarily COVID, but many drugs don't work on everybody, and they're therefore never approved. But if you start to target your drugs to genomes, they're very, very effective on certain peoples. And so you have these subpopulations that you can then target if people are sequenced. So that may be some of the future. But I do want to pause in what you said about this huge advance in the new mRNA vaccine, because a lot of people think of our collective response to the COVID as a disaster, and I think it's a miracle, because it could have been so much worse. And it's a testimony to the fact that we had a society that was able to operate with so few people making things or doing things, and we didn't starve, we didn't collapse. We actually had a civilization that continued to work and produce a vaccine. And that, to me, is a huge testament and reason to be optimistic. And part of that came from your book, and realizing that, again, it's not a ratchet where we can't ever go back, but I think what just happened is evidence to be optimistic about the future.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And there are a couple of things that I would say about it. The first is, take it back to 1918. The mortality in 1918 was so much worse than COVID. I mean, for all our ability to survive, we still have lost, we're going to lose 600,000 people in the United States, almost certainly more than that, actually, millions around the world. So there's all this tragedy. But if you look at 1918, there was, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people died on a planet that had 2 billion people. So it's, orders and order of magnitude bigger, I guess it probably would be. But there's always been this interesting question about the Great Influenza and that outbreak, which is that it didn't seem to leave that much of a kind of imprint on the popular memory and consciousness. World War I did. There's 1 million books written about the aftermath of that war. It's central to, every American literature course. It's got this section on the Great War in modern memory and Hemingway and, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But you don't see, there's very little written about this pandemic that killed more people. And I think the answer to that is that it happened at a point where a bunch of young people that you knew dying of an infection over 5 or 6 days was really not that unusual. And these were people, grown-ups, who were 30 in 1918, were born into a world where life expectancy was 40, and 40% of your kids died. It had gotten a little bit better right before then, but it was still very recent memory that life was just like that. And so it wasn't all that different. The crazy carnage of machine guns and aerial bombers, that was new. But a bunch of people you knew dying suddenly of a flu, that was old news. And that it was bigger on a global scale was hard to appreciate.
I buy that. I think you're right.
And so with COVID, I think part of it is, it seems so, it is terrible. I don't want to take anything away from it. I wish it hadn't happened. It's a terrible tragedy. But part of the reason why it seems so shocking to us is that we have grown accustomed to the idea that, we don't have to alter our behaviors in any way. to ward off infectious diseases because they aren't really a major force in our life anymore.
Right.
And so we've had this kind of return of the repressed in a sense that we've had to deal with that was very different from the situation in 1918.
Right.
But to your point, like the thought experiment with COVID is just imagine that it happened 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine, it took us 4 years to just identify the virus that caused AIDS in the 80s. 4 years. Imagine COVID, where it takes us 4 years just to figure out what the virus is, not make a vaccine. We still haven't made a vaccine for HIV.
Yeah. No, it would have been
so it's an amazing achievement in that way.
There was another aspect of it that you did mention in not your book, but in the PBS show that I have confirmed, which is I believe that the COVID-19 virus is the first time where it's the first event to affect every single person alive on the planet at the same time.
Yeah,
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that this is the first truly global at the individual level event on this planet. And one wonders how we're going to remember this. Yeah. Will it just be, okay, we solved it and nobody remembers it in 100 years? Or was this something that became kind of a seminal event, a marking, and we'll have anniversaries about it? I don't know, but I do believe that this is the first time we had a global event that affected every single person alive.
Yeah, the way I think that I phrased it in the show was it was probably the greatest, kind of short-term change in human behavior on the planet, that you'd never had so many people respond to a single kind of event and altering their behavior in sync with each other. Not that everyone altered their behavior, but we've never had such a mass transformation of people's ordinary routines as we had with COVID. And our ability to do that, that's, we can look, we had some really depressing anti-science attitudes and people refused to be, but we also had enormous compliance. Just amazing. You like this in the Bay Area. I remember coming back to Brooklyn. We left for like 6 weeks, and then we came back in early May, so it was still like the horror of it was still very vivid. And just walking around, masks, people understood at that point that masks were, and just walking around and be like, wow, every single person on the street is wearing a mask. 100% of the people on the street are wearing a mask. And we're just doing this together. We've all agreed that this is something we need to do for each other and for people we don't know. Healthy people who probably weren't really at risk were doing it. And that is, it's a beautiful thing in a way, in the midst of all the horror, that we were able to do that.
Right. So I'm the ever optimist, very, very optimistic about the future. So I always am looking for the silver linings. Like, what are some of the positive things that might come from our understanding of the things you talk about in the book, the value of these network of knowledge and the scientific methods producing this, and the activism and the agitators? What might be what might we keep from this and take into the future? I have a hope, this is not a prediction, I have a hope that we would realize the value of public health and the fact that my health depends on your good health.
Yeah.
No matter where you live in the world, not just next door, but unless the people in India are healthy, I'm not going to be healthy in the long term. And that kind of a sense of universal healthiness would be a tremendous thing to kind of take away. I don't know if we're going to go there, but that would be one thing that might happen. And a second thing that might happen, we're seeing it right now, is vaccine passports. The fact that we don't have a very good way of transmitting, communicating our state, our health. And again, this new understanding that your health affects my health, therefore I have some stake in demanding to know about it, or at least the society does at large. And maybe we have finally some upgrade to our medical record system. I don't know. Can you speculate at all on that?
Yeah. those are great observations. So on that second point about medical records, it's one of the things that I found shocking was just how much of the COVID data collection and sharing ended up having to be done by volunteer groups, like our friend Alexis Madrigal and other folks. That there wasn't a built-in global repository for all that information, and so hopefully we've learned that we need those things, and we want to have the infrastructure so that the second a new event happens, we're collecting data in an organized way, in a structured way that we can share and people can learn on. We don't have to invent it on the fly the way we had to do this time. But to your point about a broader awareness of public health, so like one of my favorite, I think one of the most important stories that's in both the book and the show, and there's a long sequence about it with our friend, fellow Bay Area Marin person, Larry Brilliant, at the end of the episode on vaccines, which is a story about smallpox eradication. And this is something I just feel so passionate about, which is it's such a it exemplifies why historically I think our priorities in terms of the stories we tell ourselves about progress have been skewed towards the wrong things a lot of the time. And smallpox was this ancient killer, right? Back to the pharaohs. Hundreds of millions of people, many of them young, killed of this incredibly devastating disease. And we'd eliminated it in most of the industrialized world by the 20th century, but it was still a major curse for the 20th century in the rest of the world. And then after that long history of death, in 1975, we wiped it off the face of the earth. And you went from hundreds of millions of people dying to zero. Nobody has died from smallpox in the wild since 1975. And to me, the way I keep thinking about it is every kid knows that we landed a man on the moon. That is just a fact of life growing up. That there was this Apollo mission and we celebrate all that. But how many kids know that we eradicated smallpox? And yet, if you think about it, I don't know, in terms of the 1,000-year scale, the 10,000-year scale, we'll look back on it and say the moon landing was pretty big because we eventually became an interstellar species, and thus it was a big milestone. But in terms of everyday life, smallpox eradication mattered way more. And it's this beautiful story. It's a thrilling story. It's a story of technical ingenuity and daring, and hundreds of thousands of people, ring vaccinating villages and global institutions trying to oversee this whole thing, and the United States and the Soviet Union collaborating. It's just awe-inspiring. And why isn't it one of the fundamental things you learn when you take your history survey class?
And why aren't we doing it for the next diseases like polio why don't we?
I think because we don't tell these stories enough, and so people don't know that they forget that it can be done, and so when we have a new crisis, they're like that there's a subclass of people who don't, one, want to get vaccinated, two, don't want to listen to the public health officials, three, are wary of global collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Surprise! It's because they don't know they don't know that they're the beneficiaries of these things.
Right,
so
exactly.
I hope that maybe that COVID, for all the backlash that's been depressing to see, maybe it will push us in a positive direction and net and the end of it.
So one of our common friends and a long now board member, Stuart Brand, has a question, which is, if we imagine our lives continuing to extend on average, what impact might that have on long-term thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as an advantage, or have we actually been able to, as we have already extended our longevity, have we become better at long-term thinking?
It's so sweet that Stuart, of all people, would ask that question, because one of the weird things that I had in my life when I moved to California, I moved out to California full-time for 3 years, and I moved back and just kind of for reasons that I don't fully understand, but whatever it is, a lot of the people I became close to out in California because I was finally with them in person, and that includes you, Kevin, and but particularly Stuart, who's a little older, were a generation older than I was. And so I was 44 or something like that when I moved out there, and maybe even younger. And a lot of my close friends that I spent a lot of time with were 65, 70, 75. And it was one of my favorite things about it, actually. I didn't have a lot of 65-year-old friends in New York, because I'd kind of gone to New York with my college cohort, and those were my friends, and people my age. And so suddenly I had this different generational thing. And I realized that one of the things that has become clear to me in writing this book is that one of the great things, one of the undeniable kind of progress elements that we were talking about at the beginning that you get from societies that live longer is intergenerational connection. The youngins are around to talk to the old folks, and as now that I identify more with the old folks than the youngins, it has made me think, like, I don't know enough 25-year-olds now that I'm 52. I need to, like, hang out with more young people. So I need to move somewhere else where the young people are.
Well, you have kids. The kids will teach you.
No. I mean, I do get that actually from my kids a little bit, but that and it's a two-way thing. There is the like older people have a perspective on the world and remember things and see the changes more clearly. And the younger people come into the world without a set of assumptions about how things should work, and push boundaries for that reason and all that kind of stuff. And when you have societies where there is 2 or 3 generations that are living long enough to interact with each other, I think those are both on the emotional level of, like, you get to meet your great grandkids, and on the intellectual level of, like, the dialogue between those generations is a sign of a very healthy society, or leads to a healthier society. So I think that's one of those wonderful side effects of this that we probably don't appreciate enough.
Yeah. So I have one last question, and then we want to take some questions from viewers on the YouTube Live, which, by the way, so if you are watching on YouTube Live, you can put your questions in the comments and they'll be relayed to us here. So, Stephen, you've been, this was a 3 or 4 year project. You were starting to write about what was the cultural echo of the 1918 pandemic, and they became kind of a very loud resonance with the COVID. Did anything you uncovered in your research and writing the book change your actual behavior yourself, or change your mind about something? I don't mean just factually, but just in some way changed your life? Did it shift your understanding in any way?
No, my understanding was completely intact and perfect when I sat down to write it. Yes.
Thank you for being honest.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, in a million little ways. Like, there are so many things that I didn't know. I think that some of what I've just said, I hadn't fully just settled on the magnitude of the smallpox eradication project. But probably one of the biggest ones, I think, is something I alluded to before, which is that in the pantheon of innovations that drive progress, we underplay the invention of institutions. So there are a couple of wonderful letters that Thomas Jefferson, who was a big early advocate for vaccination, writes to Edward Jenner, who invented the smallpox vaccine, and this other doctor. And he has this old grand vision in 1803 that we could eliminate smallpox from the world. And it's beautiful to read, it's beautifully expressed, but it's laughable in the sense that there was no way to do it. You could not even begin to think about eradicating smallpox. And then, as I wrestle with in the book, by 1975, you could do it. So what changed, right? And what changed was a lot of different things, but one of them was you needed global institutions like the WHO. You needed an organization that was capable of organizing behavior in dozens of countries around the world, and overseeing that and funding it and doing all that kind of stuff. And that there was no organization in the world that could do that in 1800, but there was by 1975. And so again, this idea that I was talking about in a sense with the FDA as well, that, just like we want to emphasize the invention of things like randomized controlled trials, sometimes we also want to emphasize that institutions, for all the bad press they get, and the mistakes they occasionally make, those are breakthrough things. And there's certain decisions that we face as a society going forward, like, for instance, radical life extension. For instance, do we want to live forever? Do we want to have that option if that is scientifically possible? Well, that's a big decision, and maybe we need to learn how to make collective decisions like that as a species. We don't have an institution that does that, but perhaps that's the next one of those innovations down the line we need to come up with. So I'm kind of answering your question from like 30 minutes ago.
No. I mean, as you're speaking, and it kind of resonates with, I think, some of the theme of your book, which is this idea of global institutions and the role of large institutions that were required to bring us this longevity. That it's not something you can kind of get individually and by your own effort.
Yeah.
It is, in that sense, communitarian in scope, and more so as I think about the inventions that you talk about, every single one of them were international in that sense. They weren't national. You can't do that just by remaining nationalistic. You have to be globalist in some senses. And so perhaps what we're seeing is a move, despite all the counter forces, to a globalist institutional view of the world, which is really not in fashion.
Yeah.
I don't know what they call that party that says global institutions are the solution.
Yeah. The George Soros party.
Right, exactly. But
yeah, I mean, I
global, you're trying to make them cool, right? You're saying global institutions are cool. So
I like I do, part of me does feel like it is good to stop and say, I consider myself a citizen of the world. Like, that is a lovely thought. And we should do it more often, I think.
And I think that view of that science that you're talking about, that activism, all that stuff, operates at that level. And that was, for me, the big message of your book. So let me just see if there's a question or two in the few minutes we have. Again, I don't know who these people are because their names didn't come across, but someone was asking about the power of intergenerational households and in terms of longevity, and whether that would play a role in the next big thing.
Well, I guess from what I've already said, that I think that intergenerational connection is amazing. But the one thing that should be said about this, that is related to that in terms of what happens in that household if people are living longer and longer, is something we haven't really touched on. And actually don't really touch on it that much in the book. It just shows up at the very end, but a very important point, which is the distinction between health span and lifespan. And so, lifespan is how long you live. Health span is how long in that period are you really fundamentally healthy, and how much of it at the end are you just being kept alive in physical pain, incapable of doing basic things that you like, all that kind of stuff. And we've gotten really good at expanding lifespan, sometimes without doing as much work on health span. And so when you have intergenerational houses, one of the reasons you have those things is because the people at the end of their life who are not healthy need their family to take care of them. And so a big goal going forward should be not just that last number of lifespan, but making sure that we're also expanding health span. And that's harder to measure. And so thus it's harder to kind of target your resources to see if you're improving it. But I think that's a big issue. And that's something I hope, I'm hopeful we're going to do another season of the show based on some of the material that's in the book, but also other material, and health span versus lifespan in that intergenerational context would be really great to explore.
Well, I hope you do get to do another season. I enjoyed the seasons or the episodes that I saw of the PBS show. It's not the same as the book. It's different. It's different and good. And I recommend the book. Again, easy read, lots of news, very relevant. You'll learn a lot, and I learned a lot. Thank you, Stephen, for writing it and sharing it with all your passions and researches. For everybody else, you've done the hard work of surfacing this. So thank you. I'm so glad that you are writing, and I look forward to what's next.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you for all your great influence and Long Now and Book Passage. What a great evening this has been.
Thank you both so much. This has been really incredible. And again, everyone who's enjoyed this talk and has not picked up the book yet, it's Extra Life. There's a link in the YouTube chat where you can buy this book, and also The Enemy of All Mankind, which has also just come out in paperback. There's a link to buy that as well in the YouTube chat. I believe, Stephen, did you send some book plates to us? I'm not sure.
Yeah, they're on their way, I believe.
Perfect.
So
we
if
will.
People are a little patient. They're signed. There will be signed copies available as well.
Perfect.
I have signed them and sent them.
Perfect. So yes, we have book plates on the way for this or Enemy of All Mankind. So if you'd like a signed copy, they are available. If you enjoyed this event and you want to see more, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We appreciate that. It helps us get more people to see these wonderful events. And thank you both so much for being